This is the construction review focus group. So if you are not here for the construction review focus group, you're in the wrong Zoom, and you'll have to go back to that that email that was sent out and click the right Zoom link for the other focus groups. So some details about how we're going to handle this. We want to hear from you. Staff is wanting input from the public, from design professionals, from the community members of Monroe County. So we want to hear your thoughts and your expertise on some of these topics. That way we can create the most thorough and comprehensive and community-friendly zoning ordinance as we move through this process. The purpose of the slide presentation is to help you pick the right Zoom chat, as well as help you think through the content in a different way, possibly larger scale. Maybe the slide deck that I'm about to show you is something that you aren't familiar with, something that planning staff goes through on a daily basis when we're working through certain aspects of permitting and site plan design and that sort of thing. So as I stated before, there will be questions integrated into these slides and at the end. So we'll have plenty of opportunity to have discussion in this one. This is one of the more discussion forward focus groups. So please raise your hand, post a question in the chat, or email planningoffice@co.monroe.in.us. So those are some avenues for speaking this evening, as well as putting your opinions out there. I will state, if you have any questions about a specific property, maybe that's your property, your neighbor's property, or a certain commercial property, we recommend that you reach out to our office. We're open Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And you can reach us by calling our office number, 812-349-2560, or emailing us at that link, and ask to speak with the planner of the day. So more property specific questions, go that route, and we'll be able to assist you with relation to the CDO, or if you have more questions directly related to how the zoning ordinance is at the moment. Okay, so here's just some quick helpful Zoom tips. There's a Q&A button, and there's also a chat button. Both of those should be in operation. I know for a fact that the chat is working, and then you can raise your hand. And these two windows will open once you've clicked on those. Just some quick little pointers if you're unfamiliar to Zoom. Also, if you're joining from a cell phone, here on the screen are some details regarding raising your hand, lowering your hand, adding to the chat, and making sure your audio is on and off. And then finally, this is from an iPad. So there's a join audio, raise hand, chat button, all the same buttons. They just might be located in different areas in the format of the program. Okay. All right. With that aside, we'll get into the content of this focus group. So overall, we're looking for, or we have a bunch of data regarding the county. What uses are highly demanded in the county. We're going to go over some of that data. The focus area today, construction review, I'm going to go through a specific example related to religious facilities. And we're going to go through some discussion about parking standards, landscaping standards, as well as other dimensional standards like lot size, setbacks, maximum lot coverage, that sort of thing. Okay, so here are some of the data that I just mentioned. This is site plan and PUD uses from 2015 to present. We've seen at least 60 different uses come through the planning department office from that period of time. And you'll note that there are, it's fairly distributed, but we do have a few uses that have seen more activity than others. So for example, government facility, religious facility, as well as a tourist home and cabin. It looks like multifamily dwelling and general contractor. So this chart here is not necessarily, to fruition projects. It could be inquiries, it could be permits that have been applied for, all across the board of information. Okay, so here's a more highly demanded uses, a more specialized chart for those. that we picked out. So we have general contractor, government facility, medical manufacturing, multifamily dwelling, office, religious facility, school K through 12, tourist home or cabin, and warehousing. Okay, so here we have a question break. If there are any design professionals in the focus group, I'm not sure how many there are that are present, but we will be forwarding these questions to local design professionals if they're not in attendance tonight. And again, this meeting will be recorded, so for future review, it will be available to them. But some questions that we have are there uses that you have clients come to you with that you have to tell them that the use is not permitted in the county or on the parcel of land that they are interested in? In other words, are there projects that are a non-starter that come to you? Because we don't see those. We only see the ones that get to us through, the filing of permits, the requests for pre-designs. Occasionally we'll have inquiries, come straight to us, but we know that, design professionals in the area, they are a first stop for many. And then the second question is, are there certain parts of the county that you are seeing interest from developers to develop, but the zoning ordinance restricts it? So those two questions, if anyone has any input on those, feel free to raise your hand or request to speak. And I don't know if we actually have any specific design professionals or, okay, so we have Elizabeth has risen a hand and Tron has risen their hand. And you should be able to speak, Elizabeth, if you just click the unmute. There you go.
I just wanted you to know, because since I see nothing in here about who is attending, I just wanted you to know that I was here.
Okay. TSD, I think, I thought that people could see participants. Is that?
I can't see anything.
You can't see anything?
No.
Okay. Well, if we want to take a moment then, anyone that's in attendance, you can, in the chat, list that you are in attendance. We have 9 attendees. And we have 6 attendees and 3 panelists, myself, Daniel Brown, who's a planner, and then the TSD host, AJ. So if you want to take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat, we can do so.
That's what I was going to say, Drew, is I can't see participants. I introduced myself in the chat. It would be really great to have some idea of what's going on. I did have my hand up for quite some time too. I know you're trying to move this meeting along efficiently, but the reason I'm raising my hand is due to some of, I think, these hiccups we're going to have with our virtual meeting. And it would be very nice just if we could ask people to introduce themselves in the chat. I'll go ahead and reintroduce myself again, just in case people showed up after I post that. And then I'd recommend that TSD occasionally drops those links that they put in prior, because anyone that joins late, they don't get the history of the chat. Right. So
yes, that's a good point. Thank you.
Sorry to jump in there, but it's just, I feel a little lost on my end because I have no idea of how many people. And I know TSD said they changed the participants and we can view it, but we can't on our end. So maybe if they wanted just to say how many are in attendees, and if it changes, they could just drop that in the chat so we have a sense of what's going on our end.
Okay.
And I'm not planning on taking too much more of this meeting up with my comments. I'm really here to listen, but I'm just trying to give you a perspective of our end and what could be helpful. So,
okay.
We currently have 6 attendees, including Katz. There is also Elizabeth, who has already spoken, Tron and Wright Randolph, who has already spoken, as well as Tracy Lutz, Realtor, Mary Jane Hall, and Bernie Garatas, who is a member of the Monroe County Plan Commission.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, so seeing that I don't believe anyone's raising their hand about these questions. We will forward these to some design professionals in the county and get some feedback that way. So I'll keep moving along with our example here. So with construction review, we're going to go through an example of religious facility. And we'll have some details about the current zoning ordinance and the future zoning ordinance, the county development ordinance. So religious facility, we're changing the name to religious assembly. It does have it's permitted in each of these zones. It's permitted in all the rural zones, as well as the residential zones, and also permitted in the business zones. It is permitted with standards in the airport zone. You'll note here on the far right of the columns. And that one condition or standard, if you will, states development in the airport zone must comply with Chapter X. Chapter X is just a placeholder. We have a separate chapter for the airport zoning. So it'll just have to, it's a placeholder to really make sure that any kind of development follows along with the specifics of that unique zone. So here's a quick question for the group. Are there any conditions that you can come up with off the top of your head that might be helpful for consideration of a new religious facility in the county? So we're going to go into some specifics here in a moment about parking, landscaping, lot size, and that sort of thing. But is there any type of condition that might fit better here or that might be worth mentioning regarding a religious facility?
Bernie Garitas currently has his hand up, but he specified in chat that it's for the prior question.
Oh, okay. Yes, go ahead, Bernie. TSD, if you could unmute him.
Hi, Drew. Nice job on pulling this together. You're getting into it, but I thought this example of a religious facility is a very good one because it's easily seen from State Route 45 and Russell Road. And it was one that was done several years ago, and it's been gradually becoming more and more. And I don't attend this assembly or this church, but it's become a very popular destination for people in the community. So I'm going to back up now, but nice job on how you prepared that. On the bar chart for the site plan and uses from 2015, one question I've got, because you mentioned on one government facility is that's the highest number of inquiries. Is that the best way to say it?
I want to say since it's site plan and PUD uses, I want to say that that's actual filings.
Oh, okay. I thought you said it was people that have come in and discussed it. Okay, so on the government facility on the y-axis, is that 20 government facilities?
Yes, that's the number of filings.
Okay.
And that could include site plan amendments. That could include PUD outline plan amendments. So that's not necessarily meaning that there are 20 new government facilities. And government facility is it's an umbrella term for,
okay.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted to clarify, because I was kind of surprised by that number.
Sure.
My second question is, and actually my misunderstanding of what you said sparks this question, but we've had a couple petitions in the county that have been denied at the rezone stage, and they're primarily single family residential, maybe multifamily or mixed use. But I wonder if it wouldn't be interesting to go back and incorporate some of that information in this, because that would give a good number of requests. Back to your first question, you see what I'm saying? And again, I'm thinking of South Rogers Street or that road where we had petitions that came through and that were denied, but they were requests for a certain number. So those are quantifiable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that might be helpful to understand, because that would constitute a demand going back to your first. Now that doesn't, and from the planning perspective, which I hold in high regard, the denial may have something to do more than just it was requested, and since they were rezones, there are other factors that go into it. But I think that shows a direct demand that might be interesting to acknowledge in that first slide as well, where you ask about where we ask about are there users that are there uses that you have clients come in for a demand, basically. So that's it. That was my only comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I wanted, this was prepared a while ago, these bar graphs here. And I want to say that they include any type of filing that we've received. So from a filing, it can, go through the process and get approved or denied. So I think that is included here, but it would be helpful, I agree, to have a separate bar graph breaking down basically the uses that maybe were denied and seeing what we're seeing a trend in. Okay. Any other questions?
Looks like Tron and Wright Randolph has his hand.
I'm really trying to get others engaged to speak. So please, if you feel like you have something to say, speak so we can hear and listen. But I also support kind of what Bernie was saying and your suggestion to kind of have that other stat to kind of see what trend is going on. I think that would be great information. So I did want to mention that, but also encourage anyone that hasn't spoken that thinks they may or may not want to just do it. I think it's a small group, and I really would love for others to participate in this discussion.
Absolutely. And if you don't want to speak on mic, you can also add it in the chat, and we can have Daniel or myself read the question out loud. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We can come to them at any time. Being that it is a smaller group, I am very comfortable with pausing the presentation, answering those questions, getting some discussion going. Okay, with that, I'm going to continue on. So this is where we left off. I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next slide here, and we're going to continue on with our example of religious facility. So this picture you see here, the aerial imagery, this is City Church. So we're going to go through a example of the parking lot standards, landscaping standards, and dimensional standards that would come about through a project like a religious facility like this. So essentially, what can happen with this is a property owner comes to us, and if they are looking to do a use like a religious facility, typically they would initiate that process with a use determination form. And that goes through planning department, where a planner reviews it initially, and then the planning director offers their classification of the proposed activity. So for example, before City Church was here, if it was a vacant lot and someone were to come to our office and ask about, starting a church, that would be a fairly easy use determination form, in that they would, very easily be classified into a religious facility, and then they would be directed to submit a commercial site plan filing. Right before that filing, there's a pre-design or pre-filing conference. That is a worksheet that gets filled out by planning staff, which covers a whole list of items that covers some of the items that you see on the screen, as well as other things like setbacks. Are there any streams or ponds or steep slopes on the property that need to be concerned about? Neighboring uses, all kinds of things get wrapped up into that pre-design to kind of provide a property owner or prospective builder or developer some guidance into what they should expect from the planning side of things. So with this particular use, we'll go over the parking standards, landscaping, dimensional standards. So for parking, in Chapter 806 of our Monroe County zoning ordinance, it lays out all the details for parking, especially with commercial developments or other developments such as a religious facility. And within that chapter, it talks about how many parking spaces are required. So for example, religious facilities they require one space for every 4 seats that are in the actual church or religious facility itself. So now I'll ask some quick questions with that. So does anyone have an opinion on the parking minimums or a parking maximum? Right now we have parking minimums. So they could certainly go over that minimum of 1 space per 4 seats. But we're looking for some input on that, as well as your opinion on using certain materials, paving the parking lot versus gravel, or even the use of permeable pavers. Those are pavers that allow for surface water to drain through to help with runoff. So I'll open the floor to any questions now for talking about parking and minimums, maximums, and materials.
We do have a question about this site in general from Mary Jane Hall in chat. She asks, wasn't this an existing facility?
This is an existing facility, yes. So I'm kind of going over this example as, that previous spiel that I gave was kind of from ground up if there was nothing. But yes, this is an existing facility, and they've gone through the channels with planning to have a site plan and building permits and all of that. We're going to see some plans here in a minute what that submittal for landscaping looks like. Oftentimes too, this particular site was done in phases. So they built sections of the facility as well as sections of the parking lot area. And sometimes that can be done through a phasing plan from the start, or it can be done, incrementally through time. So they'll submit a site plan and we'll approve it as long as it meets all the requirements like parking and landscaping and other design standards. And then maybe 5 years from then, or sooner, they want to expand the church and they want to expand the parking lot, and that would go through a site plan amendment. This one in particular has gone through several iterations, as you can see, the difference in the surface area of the parking lot, as well as the multiple structures that are here on the aerial image. So does anyone have any opinions on parking minimums or parking maximums in this regard for commercial uses?
I do not see any hands raised as of yet.
Okay.
Oh, wait. Scratch that. Tron Enright Randolph and Bernie Garretaz have both raised their hands.
Okay.
I mean, we got to figure out how to have a discussion here. I'm afraid we'll get through this, and that's fine. We're out by 7. I have dinner plans, but I'm willing to push those back. I don't know. I think what I wanted to say is that, what kind of incentives could be built out to encourage people to use, pervious pavers? They cost more. So, it'd be interesting, where's the trade-off, and have we looked at trying to really create better incentives to push kind of more environmentally sound construction kind of operations? So that's it, and I'm only adding comments to hope stir up some conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's kind of my point too on saying are engaging, because I really do want to hear the public, but maybe if we ask questions or maybe our experiences can help that along. I actually like the mute and unmute that we've got set up, just because we're not talking over one another. I think that's maybe why staff has got it set up. That's why I would rather have a forum in person versus Zoom, but at least we are getting the dialogue going, and that's important. So a couple of things. One, I think one thing we need to remember as a county planning entity, and I'm part of that, is nobody knows their knitting better than the person doing the knitting. So different statistics and uses are important to understand generalizations of what the user needs, but maybe build in some flexibility into what we're requiring based on what people are telling us. So, you know, just like we're talking with the Zoom, I think there are a lot of churches that they have attendees at Zoom that don't go to the service anymore, right? So that may be a factor. Why does that matter? Well, it would cut down on the cost if they don't feel like they need to build up to a minimum. On the contrary, the maximum could have the same type of negative result, because you know you've got a huge parking lot that you're investing in and nobody's using it, and maybe a place like a church isn't looking at the what ifs. I think the second part of this, and this is another reason why this is a great example. I remember when Kevin Potter did this design. Kevin did great work. And there's a section that's an old parking lot, and there's a section that's a new parking lot. Well, we need to look at how difficult it was and what perceived hurdles that the petitioner had to go through in order to get that site plan amendment, right? And not just the cost, but the process itself. You know, religious facility of all the uses is most of the time a pretty simple process. And so I'm kind of tagging not just with the religious facilities, but with a lot of commercial, semi-commercial, multifamily type uses. You know, how easy is it to go ahead and say, okay, right now I don't need a half acre of parking. I only need a third of an acre. In 5 years, I'm going to grow, and I'm going to need to increase that by 75%. But I'm afraid it's going to be too difficult to do that, or I'm not going to be able to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and get it now while the getting's good. And I think that that's a very legitimate and realistic reaction that people might have. And I think it's something that we need to think about. Secondly, when it comes to, again, I think that our users need to be able to define what's going to work best for them. I think if you're using pavers or some of the permeable or pervious surfaces that allow the water to filter through, there should be stormwater credits for that. You shouldn't need to build as big a bioretention basin. You should get some sort of quantifiable offset, and we do that in other areas. We do that for buffer yards with fencing. If we put up an opaque fence, we can reduce the width by 50%, I think is what it is. I mean, we do that in other places, and I think that we should look at it because, like Tron said, these are highly expensive pieces of infrastructure, and they can be highly expensive to maintain the permeable pavers. And, you know, there's certain permeable surfaces out there that aren't as functional as others. So I just think that we need to look outward. I think we need to trust the petitioners and their engineers and their surveyors and their design professionals to tell us what they think they need. And maybe not necessarily, you know, we can have a minimum or maximum, but I think that we've got to give a little bit of leeway with that, and then not push them through Plan Commission or push them through BZA or push them through some sort of process, and give staff the ability to make some of these decisions, because staff can always punt and require something go to the Plan Commission, or they can always require someone at a higher approval authority to take it because they're at a point where they cannot come to an agreement with the petitioner. And so there's another body to go to. But I think that we ought to keep it as simplistic as possible, trust the professional staff in some of these matters, and still have oversight like every employer does. But I think we need to look at it from maybe that set of lenses, because I do think that people get while the getting's good because they really don't know what to expect down the road. So that's it. Sorry to go on so long. And I know that there's a couple people on the board that probably have a lot of development experience. And if even not related to a church, but in general, I think it would be good to hear what you have to say. And that's it.
Thank you. That's good. It's good input. Okay. And yeah, to echo what Bernie says, yes, we do have some areas in the ordinance that does allow for, offsetting of other requirements, such as the opaque fence rather than landscaping, which we'll get into some of that in a minute, and getting a discount in, your landscaping count, what is required. And that's something that I've recently spoken with some planning staff, is to figure out what kind of incentives can we offer for things like permeable pavers, or maybe more environmental friendly, more climate friendly items such as that. I do know, at least for religious facilities specifically, and some other uses too, and I'm familiar with City Church's use of the parking lot for other reasons, or for other activities, not just for parking too. So it gets a little complicated with religious facility, but from a personal standpoint, I feel oftentimes a lot of commercial areas with parking, it's way too much parking. You never see some of those lots, fill up all the way. But on the other end of that, you don't want a business to grow so much and then run out of parking, and then, get, inhibited by that and cause street parking, which is, we don't want, and, that sort of thing. So it's a complicated situation, but I agree that some flexibility and figuring out a way to do that would be beneficial. Okay, so moving right along, here we have the landscaping. Okay, so this image here is pulled from their landscaping plan. So landscaping requirements from chapter 830. There's all kinds of requirements. There's interior landscaping, perimeter parking landscaping, as well as buffer yard landscaping, and sometimes, if warranted, bioretention landscaping. So what you see on the screen right now is an example of the interior landscaping, as well as the perimeter landscaping. So from chapter 830, interior parking requirements, parking islands, which are about the size of one parking space. They require 1 tree, 10 shrubs, and 10 shrubs, grasses, and ferns. Each of those types of vegetation provide a certain value that goes towards your count. But each parking island itself needs to have at least one of, at least needs to meet those requirements. Now, the way that we decide how much parking island you need is based on the total area of the parking lot. So that table right below, it shows 0 to 449,999 square feet. If you have a parking area of that size from that range, then about 5% of that total area must be an interior parking, an interior planting area. And then it goes down in tiers from 50,000 to 149,999 square feet. That's 8%, and then 150,000 square feet or larger, it goes all the way up to 10% for the interior planting areas. Perimeter parking also included in the chapter. And there are a variety of, if you will, options regarding perimeter parking, but primarily it's 5 feet wide, and it has to also include 1 tree, 10 shrubs, grasses, ferns. So that's how that's figured out. So a plan like this is developed from a design professional, and then planning staff actually goes in and reviews these measurements, these calculations, these tabulations, and we'll work back and forth with the design professional to make sure that those numbers match what we have in chapter 830 and the rest of the zoning ordinance. I will say too, we do have a species list as well for these types of landscapings. We have a native landscaping species list, as well as some other, allowable species and cultivars, because we don't want, obviously invasive species to be planted in these areas that count towards this sort of requirement. Another aspect of landscaping is buffer yard. So this table right below in the blue squares here and the yellow, this is a table that's pulled from Chapter 830 that staff uses to guide developers to understand what type of buffer yard will be required. Buffer yard is determined based on the intensity of the proposed use, as well as the adjoining uses. So the intensity use of a religious facility is considered high intensity. That qualifier is found in the use table. And then since the adjoining uses, staff goes through an area and tries to determine those adjoining uses. And so, for example, in this picture, the use to the north is single family dwelling. So you use this table to try and pinpoint what buffer yard would be required. In some situations, no buffer yards are required. For example, two single family dwelling lots right next to each other. We're not going to require you plant a buffer yard between neighbors and that sort of thing. But for these types of high intensity uses, the letters go descend from A to D, and D being the most intensive buffer yard. So D requires a 20-foot buffer yard, as well as 120 D value. And D value is what we use to quantify how many plantings you need. Certain trees, sizes of trees add more D value. And then you go all the way down to, just shrubs and grasses. They do provide D value, but, they're not going to be as much. So for an example, 420 D would be equivalent to 12 trees for 100 feet. In some situations with a buffer yard as well, there will be an opportunity to preserve existing trees, and that also reduces the requirements for buffer yard. We don't want developers to just tear down trees just to plant them back. If they're established and they're within that buffer yard area, then we recommend and encourage preservation. I see some comments in the chat, so I will go ahead and pause now for questions if we have any.
Yes, we have a few comments. One is from Mary Jane Hall saying valid points towards that was added during Bernie's earlier points. Tron Enright Randolph also added, FYI, the city of Bloomington is looking at adding maximums on parking. Oh. We also have two questions from Bernie Garitas and Tracy Lutz, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, or Lutez, has her hand raised.
Okay. So I'm reading Bernie's question. It says, Drew, ordinance at one time required an island every approximate 16 spaces. Is that still relevant? Okay, so I can't speak on to the ordinance in the past if that's how we had it. I know that this is primarily the way that we look at it now. I know that the zoning ordinance has seen some updates through time. It was originally adopted in 1997. So I'm not sure how recent this table is about parking islands. But that's something that we can look into, maybe moving away from an area calculation to just a space calculation, seeing, what that looks like. And Bernie's second question is, could you discuss what intensity means for clarity? Yeah. So in the use table, all the permitted uses have a intensity value associated with them. Now, what exactly goes into the calculation or the classification of intensity, I actually don't know. I would have to speak with the director or the assistant director to see if they have a better grasp of that. But basically what it means is it's a qualifier for each particular use. So for example, a automotive shop will have a high intensity use. So that's a use that has a potential to produce lots of noise or sometimes noxious fumes or other things like that. So medium intensity, something that's a little bit less than that. Maybe that's I don't know off the top of my head, but maybe that's like an office space. So, there's people coming and going, there's some hustle and bustle, but there's not an opportunity for, a lot of noise, late hours, that sort of thing. And then low intensity, of course, would be something more along like a single family residence, where, it's really dependent on the individual that lives there. But for the most part, that type of intensity is, quiet, one family, one individual or whoever that lives there. And, they would, be following along with, the regular hustle and bustle of day-to-day life, that sort of thing. Hope that answers or gives at least a little bit more clarity into what intensity and what we mean by that. Okay, and then we have a hand raised.
Yes, we have a question from Tracy Lutes.
Okay.
Yes, it's Lutz. You had it right the first time.
My apologies.
It's okay, no worries. I just wanted to make a comment about the plantings and the landscaping in parking areas and around the buildings. Not just the parking areas, but just all the way around. It's been my experience that there is so much of it that it can't survive, and one finds themselves constantly trying to replant, keep things alive, overgrown, spending a lot of money keeping it trimmed back. It grows and overtakes the signage, comes up past the windows. It becomes a little out of control, and it's really too bad, because I understand where we're going with it, with the green space and things, but it would be really nice if we gave some consideration to what we're requiring and make sure that we're not requiring people to spend a lot of money on landscaping that isn't going to be able to survive because there's just too much in those areas.
Okay, that's good input. Thank you. Yeah, that's something that I've thought about as well with the landscaping chapter. And you didn't mention this directly, but just with changes in climate or in seasons, maybe even offering some recommendations within the chapter about more resilient plants that would not risk dying off and having to be replanted to meet the requirements and that sort of thing. Just putting in more hardy or more resilient plantings just to start, that can help maybe reduce costs that way. Maybe you have reduced planting requirements if you choose those types of species, that sort of thing. That's good input. Thank you. Okay.
We do just have one final comments from Bernie Garitas, saying it might be useful to discuss in the CDO the definition of intensity. Your answer was as good as what I could have come up with. Thank you. And he actually also now has his hand raised.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, we're very fortunate to have Tracy Lutz on this call. She's got a lifetime of experience in the development community, not just with her background in real estate, but with the good work that her dad did over the years. So, I think she's speaking from experience. A couple of notes that I had kind of dovetail right with what Tracy has. One, I think that one thing that on the question that we've got with how do we encourage more tree preservation on development sites, I think one thing we need to look at is what's the benefit of that? What are we seeing as the benefit of suggesting the preservation? Maybe it's not a good thing. Maybe we've got situations where certain types of trees, or I'll just say vegetation, are too many is not absolutely the good thing. When we were young, we would plant a garden and we would overseed it, and then we would go through and cull it out, right? Because it wasn't healthy for the plants that we wanted to thrive. So that's kind of a thought. The second thing I think that we should look at is, in general, the parking islands cannot be productive. They I'll say some of the things that become problematic with them. Snow removal, that's something that they can be problematic with. And secondly, your point, Drew, about species was right on, because we put things in some of these parking islands, and space is at a premium, real estate that is. And so what we as a community try to do is minimize that to what the square footage area is, but then we still have to hit the species, and they're not necessarily compatible to the area within which the trees and the plants are planted for water, for the fertilization, for whatever, right? So I think that's important. And I remember Gary Udaly years ago, this probably goes back to about 1997, 1998. Okay, dating myself here. But he had a comment to me about the landscape islands, that he had just gone through and spent thousands of dollars replacing trees where cars were striking them with their bumpers. And that's just something you notice now. Go into Lowe's parking lot. I'm not telling on Lowe's, but they've got several areas where their trees have been smacked into. And I know they've replaced many of them several times. And then one point that Tracy brought up was the cost. The cost of these landscape plans, and I'm not trying to cut on the fees of anybody that does, landscape architects or civil engineers or land surveyors who produce these plans, but that is a tremendous, tremendous cost. And one of the good things that I saw was some of the stormwater ordinances that came out about 15 years ago, when we started our bioretention basins. We could find a way to credit our landscaping and our stormwater with the bioretention basins, right? So, I affectionately call that double dipping. And I think, again, just like with the opaque fence, I think we need to find ways to credit different benefits that the county sees as being beneficial, that a petitioner, frankly, may not see as beneficial. They may just see it as a regulation, and try to marry those up in a way that everybody gets a benefit out of it. And on the site plan review, and just try to strike some sort of happy medium. But I think on all this, we need to understand why we're asking for more, or why we are asking for this, or why are we stopping asking for something else. I think we really need to understand the why that goes behind all this, because that is important. So that's it. And Tracy, thanks for jumping in there. I'm thrilled that you're on this meeting.
We also have two more questions from Tron, and a comment from each from Tracy and Mary Jane Hall. Tracy says, on trees, it's important to realize the roots can and will grow into sewer lines, and sidewalks and curbs are also pushed up as roots grow. Watch where they're being required, and keep them away from these things. Mary Jane Hall says, very few native plants are both drought and salt tolerant. And Tron has two questions in the same post. How do these landscaping requirements relate to the stormwater ordinance and drainage ordinance? And second question, he explains it's more of a comment than a question. But he does also ask, if developers go above the requirement, are there any incentives to preserve or plant more trees, shrubs, grasses, or ferns?
Okay. Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so other than the bioretention requirements that we often see and bioretention plantings, I don't know how directly connected the landscaping, perimeter parking, and interior parking are to the stormwater ordinance. I'd have to speak with one of the members of the stormwater division regarding that. I do know that trees and other vegetations do provide certain ecosystem services, such as reducing stormwater flow, overland flow, that sort of thing, just by having their canopy slow down the amount of water that's hitting that impervious surface, which is then going through the stormwater infrastructure in the area. Planning staff is putting together a chart of the permitted species within the landscaping chapter, and going through and offering some suggestions on where those specific species are better. Of course, certain species of trees will be better as parking island landscaping, because maybe they don't drop as many leaves, or they don't drop as many fruiting bodies, that sort of thing, or just don't break as easy, that sort of thing. So staff is working on something like that, which hopefully will be very beneficial for the new CDO. And then to answer Tron's second question about developers go above the requirement, and are there incentives to preserve or plant more trees? In my experience, only very rarely does a developer go over the value that's required of the landscaping chapter. Usually it's spot on with those numbers. There are incentives to preserve trees. It does reduce their overall D value. So if you have existing trees on the property, those count towards that, and it reduces the amount of plantings that you have to do overall. So there are certain areas that we can count towards preservation. If they're in the buffer yard, we can count those as well as in other aspects. Okay. Yeah, so we do have some questions on the screen here regarding the landscaping chapter. And we've talked a little bit about that. One of them is, how do we encourage more tree preservation on development sites? And another question is, interior parking island, how are interior parking islands working for this use and for others, but is there a better design? So we've kind of touched a little bit on both of those, but I will open to the floor if anyone has any comments on either of those for further discussion.
We do have comments from Bernie Garatas. He says another component of the LO is the density. We should consider the real practicality of 12 trees and 100 lineal feet.
Okay. Okay. All right, I'll keep moving on. Okay, so here's a brief review of some of the dimensional standards. Now, the property that is our example, City Church, is currently zoned Estate Residential 2.5. That's in Chapter 833 of our zoning ordinance. It's one of the 2-mile fringe zones. And this chart that you see on the right side of the screen is pulled from one of the tables in that chapter. So you'll note things that are included in the dimensional standards, like minimum lot area, maximum lot width, maximum height for structures, as well as yard and open space requirements, such as minimum side yard, minimum rear yard, maximum building coverage, as well as setbacks that go from front yard or from the road, as well as the sides and rears, that sort of thing. So we've highlighted a few here regarding minimum side yard setback. And this is for structures that are on this property that are in this zone, and that's 30 feet. The minimum rear yard would be 60 feet. And maximum building coverage, which is measured as a percentage, is 10%. Maximum building coverage in this chapter specifically is in regard to the structures themselves. Impervious cover is not considered in that calculation. Otherwise, this particular example would be well over that percentage. And then we have front yard setbacks. So based on the road's classification that it fronts, it has an associated setback for structures, and then a separate setback for parking. So for structures with this example and this road classification that it adjoins, that setback is 80 feet. And that is measured from the center line of the road. And then for our parking, this number here, 26 in parenthesis, that actually goes to a later table in this chapter that talks about that. I believe it's a reduced setback, and I know that it's not 80 feet like this one is saying, because parking can be much closer to the road than we would want to see structures. Okay, so some questions and discussion topics for this aspect. So what are appropriate commercial setbacks from the side and rear? Do you feel that those types of setbacks that you see on that previous page are too much, too little? Any exceptions that should be built in for setbacks, such as adjoining a pedestrian trail, a railroad, etc. For adjoining a railroad, we have a reduced setback that's been incorporated into the zoning ordinance for quite some time. And then another question is requiring parking setback behind buildings in certain areas. So this is kind of an idea of what we want to see with some of these setbacks, because this chapter, this applies to all structures in this zone. So we're looking to see, maybe we incorporate some sort of setback specifics for specific uses, or if we're feeling like the particular zoning district does a good job of providing those setbacks from property line to structures on that property. So I'll open the floor for some discussion of that.
We do have another comment from Bernie Garitas. He says, for clarification, it might be helpful to clarify what the coverage refers to, lot size or buildable area as examples.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so yeah, to kind of tease out some of the details in this table you see here, maximum building coverage is the amount of coverage that's on the lot that's covered by buildings, i.e. their footprint, their square footage. So in this zoning district, 10% of the total acreage should, no more than 10% should be covered by a building. That's how that reads. Minimum lot or minimum lot area, that is the size of the parcel itself, the property itself. So 108,900 square feet, that translates to 2.5 acres, hence the 2.5. Theoretically, every parcel that's zoned state residential 2.5 or RE 2.5 should have a minimum lot area of 2.5 acres. Some uses in the zoning ordinance actually require a certain lot area. There's some uses like a large agricultural event center requires a certain acreage, and that coincides with some of its permitted use, permitted standards, if you will.
Bernie then asks for clarification. He says, to be more clear, is 10% calculated from buildable area or lot size? I believe that it's calculated from the total lot size, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Maximum building coverage percent, 10%. Yes, that's 10% of the entire lot size, not just the buildable area. Yes. Buildable area includes areas that are under 15% slope, that are outside of floodplain, that are outside of a sinkhole area, that are outside of other things like that. Our chapter 804 in the zoning ordinance covers what's considered buildable area. And yes, this percentage is calculated from the lot size itself, not buildable area. See another chat comment from Bernie. S/Bs are related to foundations or other built conditions. S/Bs, is that setbacks? If so,
Seems like Bernie Garitas has his hand currently raised as
Yeah,
well.
what I was trying to do, Drew, is maybe help the public understand. And yeah, I think you touched on this a little bit because you talked about the parking setbacks, but specifically what site improvements are restricted or have to adhere to the setbacks.
mm-hmm.
And I think that would be important for people to understand. And then I think secondly, where was I at with this? Yeah, I guess basically what elements of a site adhere to the setback table, where it just refers to the setback that's not a parking setback or something else. And then of course the RE 2.5, that's in the former fringe. So those, like the setback from a principal arterial, the 80 feet, that's from the center of the right of way, correct? That's not from the right of way.
That's correct. So chapter 833 is a little funny. Most of the time when we talk about setbacks, we're talking about from right of way or property line. But for frontage situations in chapter 833, it's actually measured from center line. We will be transitioning away from this kind of confusion between separate chapters where we calculate the setback. That will be part of what we handle in the new CDO.
Right. I just didn't want to alarm anybody to think that in some zones we had to be 80 feet from the right of way, which is huge, right? So
Right.
Anyway, but then again, the setbacks, buildings, garages, things like that, are swimming pools, are those considered something that would have to adhere to the setback rule?
Yeah, so let me, if you can see on my screen right now, I was trying to find this chapter. So we do have some exceptions to setback standards. And this is in chapter 804. So this is over the entire county, and there might be some more, there are some more exceptions for setbacks and reduced setbacks for certain structures in chapter 833. So for example, 804-2B, yard building setback and open space exceptions. So there's some structures here that don't require certain setbacks. So for example, architectural features, awnings and canopies, bay windows and chimneys, fire escapes, steps and porches, non-enclosed, they are allowed to extend into the setback. Things like driveways, curbs, sidewalks, fences, halls, hedges, flagpoles, planting boxes, recreational equipment, and other things like that. Those don't necessarily have to, those can be constructed in any yard. They don't necessarily have to abide by setbacks. Now, in chapter 833 specifically too, there's some situations where reduced setbacks are incorporated. So for example, detached garages can have a side setback of 5 feet. In the chapter that we looked at here with RE 2.5, normally it's 30 feet. But if you have a garage in the RE 2.5 zone, it's detached, you can have that as 5 feet. So there's a lot of little things hidden in the zoning ordinance that the planning staff is there for, to try and help you with understanding what those setbacks can be.
All right, Tron also has his hand raised, and we do have another question from Tracy, who asks, does that include barns, lean-tos, et cetera, and how is that number derived? I'm a little confused, however, if that's referring to setbacks or buildable, or
Yeah.
the maximum buildable building coverage.
Sure. Yeah. So to answer that question, yes, they do need to, structures need to abide by setbacks. But in regards to building coverage, structures that have a footprint that are enclosed, have a top over them, they count towards that coverage. So for example, an enclosed, screened-in porch, a lean-to would count, I believe, towards that coverage area. Now, the exact rationale behind the 10% rule, I don't know the exact answer to that. This particular zoning ordinance has been, was established in 1997, and a lot of Chapter 833 was incorporated from the city. But in most cases, things like maximum building coverage, other design standards like that for the more rural zones or the estate zones, we're looking at, just making sure that there's enough space. There's not just a bunch of built impervious area all across one lot, because spacing things out is better for not only aesthetics but also sometimes safety. I know that there's some building code regulations about how close certain structures can be to one another. Sometimes I think that there are some regulations behind sheds or detached garages, how close they can be to other structures, just to keep from the leaping over of fire or other things like that. But that's something that I can look into and ask upper staff, some of the rationale behind some of these numbers that you'll see in the tables.
Hi, Drew. I'm still here. They unmuted me, but I wanted to make sure we got the public's question first. And I guess I see that we're really close to the last slide, and I'm guessing the last one might say thank you. So prior to maybe moving on to that one last slide, I was going to ask you, oh no, it's the example is perfect. What practical difficulties have people encountered through your experience here with dealing with setbacks? And if you could just speak to those briefly, maybe that would stir up some ideas and questions. And sorry to put you on the hot seat, but you're the only person with the camera on, so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so with setbacks, a lot of the times from just a general planner of the day situation, people will call and ask for their setbacks to understand where they can put a structure on their property. If they are tight because of, buildable area, there's a sinkhole nearby or other conditions, we direct them to apply for a setback variance. Sometimes that's from the front, side, or the rear, and they go to the Board of Zoning Appeals. It's a case-by-case basis on those. Other situations regarding setbacks that come in across my desk are people that or property owners, maybe they just bought the property and the owners before that had built the home in a place that doesn't abide by the setback and maybe got missed by planning staff back in the day, or for whatever reason it just didn't get caught. If they want to expand on that house that's already encroaching into one of the setbacks, they too will also have to apply for a setback variance. And some of the practical difficulties behind that are, what's the alternative behind other than the variance? It's to move an existing structure outside of the setback. So that's a few things that we come across with setbacks, but hopefully, if people request and go through the permitting process, we relay those setbacks to them ahead of time so that situations like that don't happen, because we don't want to have to rely on the variance process, because it is a case-by-case basis and determined by the Board of Zoning Appeals. It can go either way, it can get approved or denied. And we just want to avoid those situations altogether by providing the information upfront and keep that information very transparent.
Tron has commented with another question. What type of discretion does planning have to approve things outside of going to the BZA?
Sure, that's a good question. So using the setback example, setbacks are fairly straightforward. If you're encroaching into the setback, you either have to go through a variance or move the structure. Now, that being said, the materials that we use to determine that setback is the zoning district that tells us what the setbacks are. But when we use Elevate, which is our web application for GIS, it shows us the approximate property lines and some aerial imagery. Sometimes those are off. So sometimes what we have to do is ask someone to go out and actually measure, or request they get a boundary survey for the surveyor that can certify that distance from an existing structure to the setback or to their property line, and then we can evaluate it that way. In regards to what type of discretion do we have moving things forward to the BZA? If you have a certain design standard that you want to have a variance from, whether that be minimum lot size, height, maximum building coverage, that sort of thing, there's no real avenue for planning staff to just grant it to you, even if it's considered a slam dunk obvious variance situation where your home is like this, the only place that on the property, it's all non-buildable area around it. You're in the setback by like 2 feet, and there's nobody on the other side of you. Although we wish we would have some sort of relief valve to just go ahead and grant that. Typically our process at this point in time is that still requires a variance application. Staff would strongly support that application, but it would still go through the Board of Zoning Appeals. I see that Bernie has a comment. My guess is that some of those requirements were taken from ordinances from other communities, especially in 1997. Yeah, that's a good guess. So certainly within the planning realm of things, planners will look to other communities that are similar or that are successful, and try to take inspiration or ideas through that, as well as referencing state codes. So there's some things that are embedded in the ordinance that I might not be familiar with that are specifically derived from a state code. Whether that be certain setbacks or other certain design standards for a particular use, for example. There's things like that 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 might even tie in loosely to a building code as well. Okay, so our last question is about maximum impervious cover or building coverage. It's been on the screen for a minute now, so I'm sure some of you have already read it, but I'll go ahead and say it aloud anyways, just so that we've talked about it. What is a reasonable standard in regards to percent of area and total square footage? So is maybe 10% in this particular zone seems a little doesn't quite fit. Granted 10% of 2.5 acres, I don't have a drawing of what that would look like specifically, but, in general, how do individuals feel about building coverage and maximum impervious cover, those sorts of standards? Tron asks, how many attendees are still present? So it looks like we still have 5 attendees, including Bernie, Katz, Elizabeth, Tracy, and Tron.
We also have another comment from Bernie, who says, one aspect we as a community need to assess is how much of the land is restricted by overlay and constraints. Less available land raises prices, supply versus demand. Many restrictions increase costs. Some, however, may reduce costs or increase land value. These need to be understood. Example, slope restrictions often increase costs.
Okay. Yeah, that's good input. Let me read through that again. Yeah, that's a good point. As planners, we're navigating tricky waters into trying to provide some guidance that promotes good use of the land, but also provides some lanes where things can't get out of hand very quickly. If it wasn't for zoning, there'd be all sorts of opportunity for anything that could happen. So we're trying to walk the line of providing, that reasonable design standards that, preserve the landscape, preserve certain aspects of the county, preserve, certain property values, all sorts of things that go into it. So that's a good point there. We have a comment from Bernie saying percent coverage is an example of a restriction that can be affected by availability of ordinance defined buildable. Okay.
Yes, and he has also raised his hand.
Okay, go ahead.
Since we're winding down here, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but my point there is we really need to understand, and we've had this conversation, we need to understand how much land that we are taking out of the buildable pool. And staff grasps that. I mean, just for the sake of so public understands, they've done a great job trying to vet out some of these answers. But we need to understand how much we're taking out of the pool of buildable land, because two huge factors in affordable housing, cost of development, is the cost of land, right? And supply demand comes into play there. And secondly, what are we imposing on members of the community or people that want to come into the community? What costs are we imposing on that final product that are increasing because of development costs? And Drew, you said it perfectly. You guys are walking the razor blade, and not the fence, unless it's a barbed wire fence, but you're walking the razor blade, which is a very precarious position to be in. So that's why, the community and planning commission members need to help, bring these topics up for discussion, because we are zoning out a great deal of land that is buildable. And, slopes are an example. The car setbacks can be an example. We've got a lot of engineering methodology and construction methodology that we can work in these areas. And we've also got a very sophisticated staff that I will tell you we didn't have in 1997. And I'm not belittling that staff at the time. And I'm talking highway, technical, I'm talking MS4. We didn't even have an MS4 then, right? I mean, we didn't have that. So, we didn't have, our Rule 5 was enacted for sites that were 5 acres or more than 5 acres. I don't know where that cutoff was. I can't remember. And it was dropped down to 1 acre. Okay. Rule 5, I think, came from the term. It was 5 acres, a rule for 5 acre sites. That was dropped down to 1 acre. It became an unfunded mandate to the DNR and the local, because they got rid of the SCS offices, and the DNR couldn't handle all the petitions coming in for 1 acre site plans. So this is kind of the evolution, and nobody can really discuss why all these changes happened and why these rules started. And I think that's what we need to get a grasp on, because many of them are irrelevant, and I think we need to understand that. So thanks for the indulgence there, Drew.
Thanks, Bernie. Okay, we have about 5 to 6 minutes left of our discussion. We will be closing at 7. So if anyone has any comments or questions remaining, please make that known. This is the end of the presentation of the slides that we have prepared. And again, if you have any interest in the other focus groups, those are all also recorded. So please, check the Monroe CDO website, monroecdo.com, and links to those recordings will be present. I see that we have another comment from Tracy. The 10-acre lot minimum rule has been detrimental to affordable housing. Oh, so she's speaking, okay, yes, that the 10-acre lot rule for subdivisions, yes. So what she's speaking on is the subdivision control ordinance has, it guides the county in what is allowed to subdivide land. If your property is serviced by a septic system, if you have basically you have to have 20 acres to subdivide into 2 lots that have 10 acres each. Now, if you are in a agricultural rural reserve zone, a forest reserve zone, or a conservation reserve zone, the more rural zoning districts, you can subdivide that property through what's called the sliding scale subdivision. And you can start that process at 10 acres. And that will create 2 lots. One of those lots has to be 55% or more of the total, but the other lot can be as small as 2.5 acres. That larger lot, though, goes into a 25-year subdivision moratorium, so it can't be further subdivided for 25 years. The lot acre minimum rule that Tracy is referring to is under what's called the minor subdivision. And that doesn't matter what zoning district you are. But yes, in order to initiate that process, you need to start with 10 acres. However, if you have the ability to connect to sewer, which presumably means you're in a more area that has more infrastructure, that 10-acre requirement falls away, and you can subdivide a property all the way down to its minimum lot size. So, for example, if you were in the RE 2.5 zone that's listed here and you had sewer available, you could subdivide a land down to 2.5 acre lots. The minor subdivision covers lots as many as 4 lots. As soon as you hit that 5th lot, you're looking at a major subdivision, which does require sewer and does require other infrastructure improvements like roadways, street trees, sidewalks, all of that. So there's just a brief overview of some subdivision regulations since that was mentioned. But yes, that's a good note, Tracy. I do unfortunately have to tell a number of inquiries that a subdivision option is not permitted in their specific property because of the zone as well as the amount of acres that they contain.
I as well. We also still have Bernie Garitas's hand raised, and Tron and our right Randolph has his hand raised. We have about 2 minutes until it's 7 o'clock.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead. Let's do yeah, Tron.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. I just kind of got a final comment. First, I want to thank you and Daniel for hosting us today. Second, I want to thank the public for coming. I think there's been some good conversation. I hope if we do this again, we can maybe allow participants that maybe have been vetted to be panelists where they could at least turn on the camera. I do like the fact that we're not talking over each other. And then finally, I do think a lot of the standards that we have today do hinder developers from building affordable homes, and we really need to focus on allowing more flexibility in certain areas, or reconsider, how much buildable area do you need to build a small home in certain zones, because this is one way we could, relieve the cost on the developer to build homes, and potentially, in hopes of kind of adding to our housing stock and, the cost of purchasing that home. I'm not going to use the terms that, cause more stir than results, but I just wanted to make that final comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tron. All right, Bernie, did you have any final comments? I saw you put your hand down. Okay, you left a comment. Tracy detailed the issue of developable land that is evident from the lack of confidence in the on-site septic treatment. Technology has provided predictable and renewable systems minors, referring to minor subdivisions, need to have septics permitted.
Yeah, and where I'm going with that, Drew, Tracy's point was perfect for, again, the supply and demand. We forget, I relearned last night based on your perfect description of a property, or Tuesday night, a property that was 19.8 acres that was not permitted to be subdivided other than, well, I don't think it was allowed as it sits even for a sliding scale. So, you know, that property and most properties should be allowed to be broken up into 4 tracts, which is only an increase of 3 lots because there's already one there. It's not an increase of 4. And we got to remember that too. But the fact that on-site septic systems are not permitted in many parts of are not permitted on parcels that meet any state statute, we need to look at backing off on that and allowing minor subdivisions to proceed and use on-site septic. And I'm not talking about treatment plants or package plants. I'm talking about, you know, Presbys and mound systems that are a proven technology that can use the same footprint time and time again if they do fail. So anyway, another good point, but we've got to get more land in the basket so we can get some of these prices down. And I think that's our task as a planning body to do that. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernie. And yes, looks like we are at our 7 o'clock, a little over time frame. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you TSD. Thank you CATS for helping host the meeting and your work here. Thanks to everyone for attending. Again, for follow-ups, go to monroecdo.com and there'll be links published for the recordings of these meetings and for future updates. All right. Okay, thanks everyone. Until next time.